Well, in other news, as so many of us are literally sweltering in the heat on the Highveld at the moment, you can see around the world how climate change has created more fires in many parts of the world. In the Northern Hemisphere summer this year, there were huge wildfires in places like Canada and Siberia. The Canadian wildfires literally cloaked New York for several days. Places like Switzerland saw record temperatures. Trevor Abrahams is the CEO of Working on Fire. He actually spent time in Canada trying to put out fires there because they needed his help. Trevor, good afternoon to you. The impact of climate change on the number of fires we're seeing, just in the Northern Hemisphere alone, it's frightening.
Good afternoon, Stephen. Yes, I mean, climate change is a major driver of what we're dealing with right now. We've just returned from Canada, 860 of our personnel. And they've burnt 18.5 million hectares of forest. I mean, that's larger than the Western Cape and a good part of Free State together. So this is on a scale that has never been seen before. And in fact, we had 13 countries represented there. We, as South Africa, were the second largest contingent after the Americans. But you can get a sense of the scale of the problem that Canada has to draw in the resources from all over the world. Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Ecuador, Brazil, Mexico, South Africa, Portugal, Spain, France. You know, so this is what we're really dealing with, the climate change. And if you look at the temperatures this year, it's off the scale. It's the warmest it's been since the 1800s. So, you know, in the Paris Accord, we're aiming at 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial levels. Yesterday, we ticked up to 1.6 degrees Celsius above.
There are different aspects to this. On the one side, it's hotter, but I imagine the other problem is that it's drier. So the vegetation is very dry, which makes it much easier for a fire to spread.
So as the climate change brings with it a whole range of extreme weather conditions, including flooding. But from the fire perspective, it's the heat that's the driver. So the heat dries out the vegetation. You have wind patterns that are accelerating, and then you have these mega fires, as we had in Knysna in 2017. And I think, you know, we are looking for a warm period now with El Nino settling in. And the end of this fire season in the southern part of this country is likely to be extreme.
So we've seen, there was the terrible fire in the Northern Cape around that army base at Lobatse, for example. What kind of events then are we going to have? I mean, we've become almost used to big fires around Table Mountain, for example, but we're going to have much bigger fires than that.
Quite correct. I mean, it's spreading into our breadbasket area, spreading to Northern Cape, which is not typical. And, you know, it's on a scale that we haven't seen before. So in this year, we've already recorded the fires where we've been at 1.9 million hectares. So that's the worst in 8 years so far. And we, at the moment, in terms of fires, we've attended 2,100. And very soon we're going to eclipse the 8-year mark on that level also by the coming 31st December. So it is getting worse.
Are there things we can do to prepare for this? Are there danger areas where you know you need to develop fire breaks or bigger fire breaks than you had in the past?
Yeah. So the UN published a report, Spreading Like Wildfire, and they pushed for a shift in policy more to prevention and preparedness, away from just combating. Combating is very expensive. I mean, the Canadians have spent more than $1.5 billion this year. So the prevention includes the education, which we do as fire awareness in our communities, in our schools. It also involves removing the foliage, the fuel load, so that you can reduce it and limit the extent of fires. And then with the kind of activities do through our fire awareness, we get to speak to the communities in sort of fireproofing their houses, removing the kind of vegetation that do spread the fires. And then something specific to our society is the alien invasives. The alien invasives like the black wattles, the eucalypts from Australia, they burn much more intensely and spread the fire more rapidly. So if we can actually jack up our program in removing those aliens, I think we are going to be in a better situation to contain the fire.
Is there any technology that would help us detect fires earlier when they're sort of covering a smaller area?
So we do have cameras, terrestrial monitoring that we do, as well as satellite monitoring that we use in terms of fires going. But at the end, is very often the human knowledge of once a fire breaks out, the knowledge of the area, what to expect from a fire breaking out, that pays off in the end. So there are new technologies coming in terms of drones that are also being used to sort of monitor and manage fires. So all the time, the science has been brought into the firefighting explained. We had a symposium at the Kruger Park recently on climate change and fires. And that was intended to bring the academics, bring the researchers closer to the practitioners. So that's an ongoing effort that's going on.
It's fascinating to me that it is people in the United States, many of them, who believe that climate change doesn't exist. And yet New York suffered for 3 or 4 days from the haze created by the wildfires in Canada. Yeah. A sort of almost unprecedented event. Yeah. Do you think people get it?
I'm not sure. I mean, if you look at just simply the temperatures, I mean, there are many, many more deaths that come from wildfires than simply people being burnt. You know, people who have respiratory problems as a result of that. And the fires in Canada and smoke in New York was clearly testament to that. Unfortunately, well, U.S. in this sense had a relatively mild fire season this year. And that's the quirks of, you know, of nature. But on the other hand, if you look at the fire in Hawaii, that was an unprecedented fire and the largest loss of human beings in any fire in the U.S. recent history. So, you know, it's a difficult project. Ourselves, I mean, we've had a devastating fire in the northern part of our country this year. It hasn't been in the news until Agri-SA started shouting about the 400,000 hectares of grazing land lost, the cattle lost. So this is in our breadbasket. This is going to hit us in our economy.
Do you think that government understands how serious this is? And I mean, there's a lot of constraints on government at the moment, of course, and people generally don't have money to prepare for this kind of thing. And yet, I mean, I imagine it's the insurance industry that will probably prod us to do it. But the fact is, if we don't prepare for it, I mean, we must literally prepare for disaster.
You know, with emergency work, it's always an uphill battle. You know, you only need emergency resources when it happens. It's a very difficult project of getting people still to budget, prepare. And that's why the UN report calls for preparedness, to prepare for something that may come. So it's an uphill battle in terms of getting the preparedness. In general, our fire services are extremely strained across the country, I think, as we've seen with some of the fires that have broken out in the cities. So it's an uphill battle in getting the message across.
Trevor Abrahams, thank you very much indeed. Do appreciate the time. Managing Director at Working on Fire.